All right, so this is my video for module 2. I'll try to keep it within the guidelines and the time limit. Got to share my screen. And please do start when I start my presentation. Okay, so let's start. So here's a quick study of Singapore, the Singapore government's social engineering in regards to language planning. The quick context is Singapore is very well known for its really high quality public education. Much of the educational policy is done because of the government's efforts to keep Singapore competitive in the world economy. Singapore is basically an offshoot of Malaysia, started off as a country in 1965, and it has three main ethnic groups, which is Chinese, Malay, and Indian. The majority of the ethnicities is Chinese, and the Chinese are comprised of many different ethnicities as well, meaning like their language base is not Mandarin. They could be Hokkien or Teochew or Cantonese or Hakka. So for the sake of the nation, the Singapore government essentially said, we have to make it a little bit more manageable. We can't have all these dialects going around. So we're going to make the official languages Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil, and English. So there's four official languages because they really recognize that English is something that you'll need in the world stage even as early as 1965. So essentially, they made a bilingual mandate, which said in schools, you're going to have to learn to speak English and your mother tongue, meaning that if your father is from Malay background, then you'll learn Malay. If your father was Chinese background, no matter what dialect they spoke before, you have to learn Mandarin, for example. So the consequence of this is all instruction in secondary dialects that were not of the four main languages, such as Hokkien or Teochew or Hakka, they were all stopped. And all people of the Chinese ancestry had to start learning Mandarin. And another consequence of this is since everybody had to learn English, English became the de facto lingua franca of Singapore, which means that all the ethnicities now speak English. And it's one of the ways that Singapore has gradually risen because Singapore right now is it's a first world country, it's a financial hub, it's a travel hub in Southeast Asia, and it's basically the envy of its neighbors because it's able to change a lot of its government functions on the fly because it's such a small country and because the government is so generally stable. So the English language is the language of instruction in most subjects, the language of the government. It's the language of the elite, the literati, and you could see it everywhere from television and then buses and radio, bus advertisements. There's no question that English is the preeminent language. So this kind of, the language policy, though, led to a type of cultural genocide. So the mother tongue became relegated, the second language became relegated to something that you basically just spoke at home, besides English. And it's also something that you could use to delineate yourself as somebody of that culture. Like if you're going to order food and you have another person whom you recognize as Chinese, you could start speaking to them in Mandarin. And if you were Malay and another person was Malay, you could identify with the language that you spoke. The secondary dialect instruction, which had been eradicated at the beginning of the language engineering, now posed a crisis culturally because the people from the 60s and 70s who only spoke that dialect of Chinese, for example, could now not speak to their grandchildren who only spoke Mandarin. So if you spoke Teochew as a grandparent, you now can't speak with your grandchild because they only spoke Mandarin. The effects on teaching as an ESL teacher. So you could argue that a lot of the business that the British Council, whom I used to work for, was essentially from this type of policy, wherein everybody was encouraging The media was encouraging everybody to get good English lessons. There was a movement called Speak Good English. Everybody was encouraged to go to the British Council to learn good English. And as a consequence, now I've had students come to me and say, hey, I want to get rid of my Singlish accent, my native Singaporean accent, and I want to speak normal English. And of course, I say Singlish is perfectly acceptable. You just have to be able to change some of your mannerisms and maybe learn how to code switch so that you don't have to necessarily speak what you think is normal English. You're already speaking normal English, the normal English of Singapore. So it's changing the students' perception of their own language abilities and confidence. Here you can find an example of a book that makes fun of the Singaporean English accent. Here are my sources, and I hope I've gotten within the time limit. So hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.